In 1978, a 14-year-old girl was living in a village in rural China. Let's call her Liu Mei. Her family worked the same fields their neighbors had worked for years, but they did not run the farm as an independent household. The land belonged collectively to the village. People worked through production teams, and the harvest was distributed according to rules set by the team. For Mei's family, life moved with the farming calendar. A good harvest meant enough grain. A bad one meant cutting back until the next season. They worked constantly, but very little of what they produced became cash. And yet, during Mei's lifetime, that village would be pulled into one of the fastest economic transformations in modern history. That same year, China's leadership began shifting the country's focus toward economic development. Deng Xiaoping became the central figure behind what would be called reform and opening up. In the countryside, one of the first major changes was to make individual families responsible for specific plots of land. The land remained collectively owned, but after families met their agreed obligations, they could keep or sell more of what they produced. Mei's parents now had a reason to plan more carefully, raise animals, grow vegetables for local markets, and produce beyond the family's immediate needs. Farming became more productive. It also meant that not every young person had to remain in the fields throughout the year. While the village was changing, another experiment was beginning in the south. In 1980, Shenzhen became one of China's first special economic zones. At the time, it was still a relatively small border area beside Hong Kong. The new zone was allowed to use more flexible rules to attract outside investment, build export businesses, and test policies before they were tried elsewhere. The location was especially important. Hong Kong companies already had customers, capital, and global shipping experience, but they increasingly lacked affordable space for production. Guangdong, meanwhile, had land and a growing pool of young workers ready to leave the countryside in search of jobs. The two sides each held what the other lacked. By 1985, Mei was 21. China's average rural net income was still only about 397 yuan per person for the entire year. The factory offers reaching her village were not necessarily generous by city standards, but they promised something farming could not: cash paid every month. Many factories also offered a dormitory bed and meals in a canteen. Mei would not need money for rent, and she could send part of each wage home. So she boarded a train heading south with a few clothes, food prepared by her mother, and a factory address written on a piece of paper. She did not know what the factory produced. She only knew that the address led to Dongguan, and that staying home no longer felt like the only possible life. The address brought Mei to a low concrete factory building. Inside, rows of young women sat beside a production line, fitting small electrical parts together and passing them to the next worker. The task was easy to learn. Keeping up with the line was harder. If one person slowed down, unfinished pieces quickly piled up in front of her. Boxes stacked near the line carried foreign names and shipping marks Mei could not read. She knew the products would leave China, but she did not know who had ordered them, where they would be sold, or how much the final customer would pay. The order had not begun inside her factory. It had come through a company in Hong Kong. Hong Kong companies knew overseas buyers. They could arrange financing, provide product designs and materials, manage quality, and handle exports. Guangdong factories provided the buildings, workers, and production lines. This division later became known as front shop, back factory. Hong Kong acted as the front shop facing the global market, while the Pearl River Delta served as the workshop behind it. One early representative case appeared in Dongguan in 1978. A Hong Kong businessman partnered with a local enterprise to establish the Taiping handbag factory. The Hong Kong side brought in samples, materials, equipment, and orders, while Dongguan provided the production space and workers. Once the handbags were completed, they were shipped overseas, and the factory earned a processing fee on each order. For overseas buyers, this arrangement lowered risk. They could keep working with familiar Hong Kong firms while shifting production to a cheaper site across the border. For Guangdong, it was a shortcut into world trade. Local factories did not need to invent global brands or find customers in New York or London. They could start by making products for companies that already knew how to sell them. The first orders were usually small, but if a factory delivered on time, buyers returned with bigger ones. Each successful shipment made the cross-border arrangement look more dependable. Soon, the question was no longer whether one factory could work. It was how many more Guangdong could attract. Once local officials saw the first factories running, they stopped waiting for investors to knock on the door. They traveled to Hong Kong to meet manufacturers, then brought factory owners back to inspect possible sites. Surrounding towns soon started competing. One offered cheaper land. Another promised faster approvals. A third said it could recruit several hundred workers within weeks. But bringing factories in was easier than keeping them running. Many towns still had dirt roads, unstable power, limited water, and bridges too weak for fully loaded trucks. A factory could have workers and a real order, then fail because raw materials arrived late or finished goods could not reach the port on time. This was exactly where the phrase, "If you want to get rich, build roads first," stopped sounding like a slogan and started sounding practical. The problem was that local governments were short of money too. Roads, power lines, bridges, and industrial sites had to be built before tax revenue was large enough to cover them. So in many places, the money had to be assembled bit by bit from several sources. Local governments put in what they could. Businesses paid for roads their trucks would use. Nearby residents sometimes contributed money, materials, or labor. In some parts of Guangdong with long histories of migration, money also came from Hong Kong, Macau, and overseas Chinese communities. Many of those donors had once left because their hometowns were poor. Years later, some of what they earned away returned as roads, bridges, and power connections. Once the basic infrastructure improved, new factories started appearing along the roads. And each factory needed far more than workers and machines. An electronics plant needed wires, screws, plastic shells, boxes, repairs, and transport. A clothing factory needed fabric, dyeing, buttons, zippers, printing, and labels. At first, many of those supplies still came through Hong Kong, but once several nearby factories began ordering the same parts, making them locally became a business opportunity. Technicians left larger plants to start mold shops and repair workshops, while small transport firms took on the job of moving finished goods. In 1978, Dongguan had about 1,290 industrial enterprises. By 1993, that number had climbed to 12,449. Mei's boss grew with the network too. His first orders were small, but repeated on-time deliveries brought bigger contracts. Larger orders meant cheaper materials, and the extra profit paid for new production lines. Within a few years, the original workshop employed hundreds of workers. Mei noticed the owner no longer arrived by bicycle, and a second factory building appeared next to the first. Her own wages rose as well, but the difference between the two of them was already obvious. Mei was still trading hours for income, while the owner could turn today's profits into machines that would earn more tomorrow. At the end of each month, Mei sent money home and deposited what was left in a bank. In that respect, she was no longer alone. Millions of other families across China were starting to do the same. Mei did not save because she saw herself as an investor. She saved because life still felt uncertain. Her parents could fall ill. The factory could lose an order. She might have to return home with little warning. At the time, ordinary workers had few other ways to invest. The stock market was only beginning to emerge, and most of the financial products familiar to households today barely existed. A bank deposit was simple, easy to understand, and backed by institutions people believed would still be there tomorrow. May's balance was small, but when the savings of workers, farmers, shopkeepers, and urban households were gathered together, the total became large enough to finance projects no single family could ever build on its own. China's largest banks, Cheyennes, were state-owned, and lending decisions were heavily shaped by development priorities. Banks pooled deposits from millions of households, then issued much larger loans to factories, energy projects, infrastructure, and industrial companies. May's money did not move directly into her boss's pocket, but it became part of the funding base that made those loans possible. Once her boss got financing, he no longer had to wait years to save the full cost of a machine. He could buy it immediately. The new machine raised output. The factory took on a bigger order. More workers received wages, and some of those wages would eventually return to the banks as new deposits. The gains from this system were never evenly shared. May got a modest interest return and a small cushion against emergencies. Her boss borrowed in order to buy machines and buildings that could generate more profit in the future. The worker saved to limit risk. The owner borrowed because he believed expansion was worth the risk. At the national level, though, the arrangement solved a basic problem. China was still relatively poor, yet it needed enormous sums to build factories, power plants, roads, ports, and housing. The banking system did not wait for each business owner to become rich enough to finance expansion alone. Instead, it gathered millions of small pools of money and turned them into large-scale investment. By the late 1990s, the fields around May's factory were starting to vanish. Survey markers appeared first, followed by bulldozers, concrete trucks, and newly paved roads. Factories had brought thousands of workers into the area, and those workers needed more than dormitory rooms. They needed apartments, shops, schools, clinics, and transport. The town needed more land, but it also needed money to build around that land. China's land system connected those two problems. A developer could not simply buy a farm plot from a private owner. Local authorities first converted land for urban construction, then granted companies long-term rights to use it, and factories or developers paid for those rights. For local governments with limited tax revenue, land use payments became an important source of development funds. A field beside a dirt road was worth little to a factory, but once power, water, and road access were added, the right to use that same land became far more valuable. Local governments could then use part of those payments to extend another road or prepare another industrial site, and the infrastructure would raise nearby land values again. This arrangement let some factory towns grow before their ordinary tax base was large enough to support all the building. It also gave local authorities a strong incentive to keep drawing in factories, workers, and real estate projects. Housing was changing at the same time. For years, many urban workers received homes through the government agency or state-owned work unit that employed them. But around 1998, that welfare allocation system largely came to an end, and more families had to buy housing on the market. May and her husband used years of savings as a down payment on a modest apartment near the factory. After May moved in, the town kept expanding. A new road cut travel time. Shops opened downstairs. A school appeared nearby. More factories and office buildings moved in. She did nothing to change the apartment itself, yet it became more valuable because everything around it was changing. The same public investment that made factories more efficient also raised the value of nearby housing. Early home buyers often benefited. Later arrivals faced much higher prices. For May, though, the apartment first meant security. She could not yet know that housing would eventually become one of the biggest stores of household wealth in urban China. By the end of the 1990s, China already had workers, factories, roads, ports, suppliers, and banks capable of financing expansion. But overseas, buyers still worried about one thing: predictability. A company might spend months moving production to China, only to face a new quota, licensing rule, or trade restriction in its home market. China had spent 15 years negotiating WTO membership, and on December 11, 2001, it finally joined. Membership did not erase every tariff or dispute, but it moved more of China's trade into a published, rules-based system of formal commitments. For foreign companies, that predictability mattered more than anything. China no longer looked like a temporary low-cost experiment that might vanish after the next policy shift. Buyers became more willing to sign longer contracts, install dedicated equipment, and move a larger share of production there. WTO accession did not create China's manufacturing system. The hard work had already been done over the previous 2 decades, but it allowed that existing system to handle much more business. Inside Mei's factory, the shift showed up first in the order book. A customer who once bought one shipment began ordering for a whole season. The owner added machines before the old ones wore out because he expected more business to come. Suppliers expanded alongside him. Container traffic increased, dorms filled up, and wages continued flowing into households. Those export orders also supported activity far beyond the factory gate, from equipment makers and trucking firms to warehouses, banks, restaurants, and apartment builders. From the outside, China's rise after 2001 looked sudden. Inside the Pearl River Delta, it felt more like 20 years of preparation finally being used at full capacity. By then, Mei had a daughter. The factory had given her a route out of the village, but she did not want Liu Xin to spend her whole life beside the same line. The family now had regular income, a home, and some savings. Mei began directing more of that money towards school fees, books, and the possibility of university. The next step up for the family would not come from another night shift at the factory. It would depend on whether her daughter could enter a different part of the economy that those factories had helped create. Liu Xin was born in 1992 and grew up near the factories that had pulled her parents to Guangdong. But her daily life already looked very different from Mei's childhood. There was electricity at home, a paved road outside, and a school within reach. Mei had left school early and learned her job beside a production line, so she wanted her daughter to stay in the classroom. The family spent money on textbooks, tutoring, and a quiet desk. When Liu Xin sat for the Gaokao in 2010, her parents waited outside the school gate. For them, those few hours carried years of factory shifts and years of deciding not to spend what could be saved. After 1999, university admissions in China expanded rapidly, opening the door to many more young people. Liu Xin got in. She learned business, English, and computers, and met students from places her mother had never seen. By the time she graduated in 2014, Chinese companies needed more than assembly line labor. Large factories had become complex organizations linked to hundreds of suppliers. Businesses needed people who could track shipments, manage orders, talk to clients, and coordinate production across cities. Liu Xin found an office job at an electronics company. Her mother had assembled products. She now helped coordinate the companies making them. Her first salary was far higher than Mei's had been at the same age. She sat in an air-conditioned office and worked on a laptop instead of standing beside a machine in a factory uniform. But city life had become more expensive too. Rent consumed a large share of her income, and the places with the best career opportunities were often the places where housing cost the most. Later, she married, and she and her husband bought an ordinary apartment far from the city center. Their combined income could cover the mortgage, but the loan would run for decades. Mei had once worried that a bad harvest or a factory shutdown could wipe out the family's income. Liu Xin worried about a layoff while the mortgage kept coming. Education had moved her into a better paid, more skilled occupation, but it had not eliminated uncertainty. It had simply changed what she now stood to lose. This did not mean her parents' sacrifices had failed. Liu Xin still had choices and comforts that Mei could not have imagined at 14. But her situation showed that once a country becomes wealthier, pressure on ordinary families does not disappear. It shifts into housing, careers, education, and the cost of holding on to a middle-class life. When Mei left her village, fewer than 1 in 5 people in China lived in cities. By the end of 2025, that share had reached nearly 68%. The landscape she moved through had changed with it. Fields became industrial parks, factory towns grew into cities, and roads that once ended in villages turned into highways linking production centers, ports, and domestic markets. Hundreds of millions of people found work outside agriculture, first in factories and construction, then in transport, retail, engineering, finance, and technology. The World Bank estimates that China's transformation lifted nearly 800 million people out of extreme poverty over 4 decades. China's factories changed too. Early export plants assembled handbags, clothing, toys, and simple electronics from designs, machines, and materials that mostly came from outside. Over time, local firms learned to make more of the equipment and components behind the final product, and the industrial network expanded into machinery, batteries, solar equipment, electric vehicles, and advanced electronics. Foreign firms, RBNs, eventually came to China for more than inexpensive labor. They came because a design could be quickly turned into molds, parts, packaging, and a finished shipment without rebuilding the process across multiple countries. By 2025, China's merchandise exports had reached about $3.77 trillion, but that figure meant much more than goods leaving a port. Behind each shipment stood suppliers, engineers, banks, logistics firms, power systems, roads, and workers shaped by decades of accumulated production experience. The gains were not distributed evenly. Factory owners, property holders, and people with better access to capital usually built wealth faster than workers like Mei. Even so, the broader shift was extraordinary. Within a single lifetime, China had moved from a predominantly rural society to the center of global manufacturing. When Mei first reached Dongguan, foreign buyers were still testing whether a Chinese factory could complete one order correctly. 40 years later, governments and companies were asking a different question. Had the world become too dependent on the manufacturing system China had built? The question mattered because the same global links that accelerated China's rise had also become a source of political strain. Other countries wanted the factories and jobs that once transformed Guangdong. Multinational firms wanted backup production in case trade disputes or geopolitical shocks broke supply chains. China had completed one transformation. Now it was about to find out how much of its position it could hold on to. I make videos about interesting business stories, economic changes, and social developments from around the world. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Rivet is still a small channel, so your support really does make a difference. And tell me in the comments, what company, industry, country, or social phenomenon should I explore next?